October 12, 1944. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The rain had been falling since dusk. Slow at first, then heavy enough to turn the parade ground into a skin of mud. By late evening, the clouds pressed so low they felt like an extra ceiling over the camp. And then, just after 9:17 p.m., the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a dimming. Everything died at once. The flood lamps around the perimeter went dark. The barracks, the mess hall, the motor pool, all disappeared into a thick, oppressive blackness. Inside Compound D, 412 German POWs froze where they were, holding their breath as if a single exhale might trigger whatever punishment they assumed was coming. For 2 full seconds, silence held the camp in a chokehold. Then chaos erupted. American boots slammed against gravel. Someone shouted for lanterns. A siren gave a strangled, half-dead wail before sputtering out. From the direction of the infirmary came a panicked voice yelling, "We've got 12 patients on oxygen. Get me light, now!" The Germans exchanged terrified glances through the shadows. Most had heard stories. Some whispered, some shouted, about what Americans supposedly did to prisoners during power outages. Their officers back in Normandy had warned them. The Americans will look for excuses. Any mistake, any disorder, they will use it against you. So when the camp plunged into darkness, instinct took over. They stayed still, perfectly still, hands down, eyes low, muscles tight, waiting for the bark of orders, waiting for the crack of rifles, waiting for the punishment the propaganda had promised. But what they heard instead was desperation. American voices, worried, hurried, strained, echoed across the compound, not directed at the prisoners, but at each other. The generator building was somewhere behind the mess hall. The emergency lamps weren't working. The guards were bumping into one another, not rounding up POWs. It didn't make sense. Friedrich Keller stood among the prisoners near the rear wall of Barracks 3. He'd been an electrical engineer before the war. 5 years with Siemens, 3 on military communications. He'd survived the beaches of Normandy, the retreat through hedge country, and the long, humiliating voyage across the Atlantic. He had learned to stay invisible. He had learned to keep his head down. But tonight, something inside him shifted. He heard the panic in those American voices, real panic, not staged menace. He heard one medic yelling that if oxygen pumps failed, they'd lose wounded men within minutes. He heard guards arguing about who might know how to restart the generator. He heard the unmistakable sound of a young soldier, just a kid, trying to keep his voice steady while fighting the rising fear in his throat. And suddenly, Friedrich wasn't thinking about propaganda or pride or enemy lines. He was thinking like an engineer. He stepped forward, then again. His heart hammered so loudly, he could barely hear his own breath. The other POWs stared at him, horrified. One hissed under his breath, "Bist du verrückt? They'll shoot you." Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But if they didn't get power back, men, patients, would die. Friedrich swallowed hard. I can fix your generator," he said, barely above a whisper. No one heard him, so he said it again, louder this time. The nearest American guard spun around, lantern in hand. He looked at Friedrich as though the German had grown 2 heads. There was suspicion in his eyes, yes, but also something else. Confusion. The kind that appears when reality collides with everything you've been told. "What did you say?" the guard demanded. Friedrich forced himself to meet the man's gaze. "I'm an engineer. I can help you." The guard didn't move. Other soldiers came running, drawn by the voice in the darkness. Their boots splashed through puddles. Lantern beams shook wildly across faces. German, American, exhausted, afraid. One sergeant stepped forward, soaked to the bone, jaw tight with uncertainty. He looked Friedrich up and down, then barked, "You're telling me you can fix the generator?" Friedrich nodded. The reaction was instantaneous. Shock, disbelief, muttered curses. One private snapped, "Sarge, he's a kraut. He'll blow the whole damn place sky high." Another said, "We ain't letting him near our equipment." A third pointed out that the camp manual explicitly forbade prisoners from entering restricted areas, but over it all came the urgent yell from the infirmary, "We are losing pressure." That sentence cut the night clean open. The sergeant made a choice. "Bring him," he ordered. For a moment, everything stopped. Even the rain seemed to pause, hanging in the air like a breath held too long. The American soldiers stared at the sergeant, stunned that he'd trust a German POW with something so critical. The German prisoners stared at Friedrich as if he'd stepped directly into the mouth of a lion. But Friedrich didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, hands visible, posture straight, every nerve screaming but his mind finally clear. Two guards seized his arms, not roughly, just firmly, and pushed him towards the generator building. Inside the barracks, whispers erupted behind him. Why would he help them? Has he gone mad? Is he trying to escape? Is he trying to save lives? Outside, the storm intensified. Lightning split the sky, revealing the vastness of Camp Shelby, fences stretching like silver scars, barracks lined like tired soldiers, mud and puddles reflecting the brief flashes of light. In that moment, the contrast between two worlds became painfully clear. America, the arsenal of democracy, glowed even in darkness. Even with the power out, it was a nation of abundance, order, and moral confidence, built on factories like Willow Run and shipyards like Kaiser. A nation that fed prisoners better than many citizens in wartime Europe. A nation that believed mercy was strength. Germany, by contrast, was collapsing. Its cities firebombed, its people starving, its armies retreating on every front. Friedrich had seen it with his own eyes before capture. And now, in the muddy yard of a POW camp thousands of miles from home, the truth hit him with the force of a blow. The Americans were not the monsters he had been told they were. They were imperfect, yes, tired, angry, frightened, but human, and they needed him. As the guards pushed him through the rain toward the powerless generator building, Friedrich's boots slapping against the puddles, one question echoed in his mind, one the audience would feel in their bones. Why would a German POW risk everything to save the lives of his captors? They reached the generator shed just as the rain shifted from a steady hiss to a punishing roar. The guards yanked open the heavy metal door, and a burst of cold, oily air rushed out. Friedrich blinked into the darkness, his breath catching in his throat. And in that instant, right as he crossed the threshold, something happened that froze him harder than the blackout ever could. The American stepped back and let him enter first. A prisoner, unarmed, in a restricted military building. It was a twist so sharp it almost tripped him. The Nazis had always said, "Americans will never trust you enough to let you stand behind them." But here he was, walking ahead of them, into a room he could sabotage if he wished. The world, for the second time that night, stopped making sense. The generator room was hot, much hotter than Friedrich expected, with a low, throbbing vibration that trembled through the floor like a dying heartbeat. The maintenance lights were out, leaving only 3 wavering lanterns that cast long, crooked shadows over the machinery. Pipes rattled. Metal pinged as it cooled. The air smelled of dust, oil, and danger. 12 years of engineering training told Friedrich something vital. The generator hadn't simply failed, it was failing. If someone didn't stabilize the pressure buildup, something inside could blow. His first step forward was shaky. His second nearly buckled his knee. Every warning, every nightmare scenario, every sentence from every propaganda officer he'd ever heard came flooding back. Americans torture prisoners. Americans starve engineers to death. Americans shoot technicians so they can't rebuild Germany. If you volunteer skills to the enemy, they'll use you, then kill you. He felt those lines pressing against his ribs like iron bars. Behind him, a guard snapped. "Move." Friedrich forced himself to breathe. He stepped closer to the generator, its massive steel shell gleaming with condensation, its pipes shuddering, its valves trembling like something alive and in pain. He reached out a hand. That's when a harsh beam of light slammed into his face. "Stop, right there." The voice was young but hard-edged, determined, angry, maybe, but scared, too. Friedrich squinted into the light until the lantern shifted enough to reveal a young American soldier, barely 20, maybe 21, with raindrops still clinging to the shoulders of his uniform. His jaw was tight, his eyes were sharp, his hands shook just enough to notice. "Turn around," the soldier said. Friedrich obeyed. The beam hovered inches from his face. "If you mess up," the soldier said slowly, "people die. You understand that, don't you?" Friedrich nodded. "Yes. I need to hear you say it. I understand." The soldier lowered the light only a fraction. Around them, the other Americans stood silently along the walls, watching Friedrich, watching the machine, watching each other. No one spoke. No one threatened him. No one raised a rifle. It was wrong, or at least wrong compared to everything the Germans had been told. This didn't look like cruelty. It looked like fear, and not fear of prisoners, but fear of losing the men in the infirmary. And that was the moment the first crack split open inside Friedrich's understanding of the world. For the first time, Friedrich noticed the Americans' faces. Not hatred, not triumph, not brutality, just exhaustion, just responsibility. Just the heavy, awful weight of knowing 12 patients needed oxygen pumps powered by the generator he was now standing in front of. He'd never imagined American soldiers could look like this, burdened, young, and desperate to save the vulnerable. One guard muttered, "We should have gotten that maintenance team from Jackson before the storm." Another said, "We're short on fuel drums because half our supply trucks got rerouted to the shipyards." A third added under his breath, "My baby sister's school collected rations for POWs this week. Why the hell would a Kraut help us?" Everything Friedrich heard cut deeper than any threat could have. The Americans weren't letting the generator fail. They were doing everything they could to prevent it, just like he would have, before the war twisted him into a uniform. As Friedrich studied the machine, he felt his heartbeat sink with the trembling in the pipes. He crouched beside the main valve, brushing dust away, and muttered, almost to himself, "Dies ist falsch kalibriert." The young American, Private Nolan, stepped closer. "What did you just say?" Friedrich translated carefully. "It's incorrectly calibrated. Someone bypassed the safety lock on the intake valve." "English," Nolan snapped, then softer. "Please." The please landed strange and heavy. Friedrich adjusted the pressure gauge with trembling fingers, his breath fogging in the warm air. The Germans had warned them the Americans would use every mistake as an excuse to punish. But here, Nolan hovered like someone terrified an error would kill the very man trying to help them. The propaganda was unraveling faster than Friedrich could process it. He remembered a poster from Berlin. Americans work for greed. But these men weren't paid extra for staying awake all night in a storm. They weren't profiting from the wounded. They weren't sneering over prisoners. They were working because someone needed saving, because it was right, because this was what their country, the arsenal of democracy, asked of them. The contrast hit Friedrich like a blow. In the lantern light, Friedrich saw something he had never understood before. He had passed through American factories on the train to Mississippi. He had glimpsed windows glowing at all hours, smokestacks belching white plumes into the cold sky, endless lines of workers moving like a human machine. Now he understood why. America wasn't just fighting with guns. It was fighting with abundance, with production, with unity. 96,000 aircraft a year, 8 million tons of steel, thousands of towns selling war bonds, families turning lawns into victory gardens, teenagers working night shifts, farmers sending surplus wheat across the ocean. And even here, inside a muddy POW camp during a blackout, Americans worked as if goodness itself needed defending. Compared to the starving, crumbling Germany he'd left behind, the difference was night and day. And that difference, more than any threat, terrified him. As Friedrich leaned into the guts of the generator, turning the corroded inner wheel to measure resistance, Nolan hovered behind him. "What do you need?" Nolan asked. Friedrich paused. No American had ever asked him that question. "A wrench," he said quietly. Nolan stepped forward, handed it to him, and hesitated, as if still unsure he should trust him. "You know," Nolan muttered, "they told us you people would sabotage anything you touched." Friedrich tightened the bolt slowly. "They told us the same about you." The two men froze for a moment, lantern light flickering across the rise and fall of their chests. A truth neither wanted to admit hung in the air. They were both lied to. Friedrich swallowed. "Why are you not stopping me?" "Because," Nolan said, rubbing rain from his hair, "those 12 men in the infirmary didn't ask to be in this war, and I'm not letting them die." He paused, then added quietly, "And maybe, just maybe, you're not what they told us either." The words hit Friedrich harder than the blackout, harder than the journey across the Atlantic, harder than any officer's accusation, because they were honest and frightening and hopeful. The pipes groaned loudly, a deep metallic moan that made the Americans stiffen and grab for their belts. Friedrich held up a hand to stop them. "No, do not touch anything," he warned. "The pressure must equalize first." Nolan tensed. "Is it going to explode?" "Not if you give me 5 minutes." "You've got 3." Nolan shot back, but the tightness in his voice revealed the truth. He'd give Friedrich as long as it took. Friedrich knelt, sweat beading on his forehead, hands blackened with grease. The machine hissed and rattled. Every wrench turn echoed in the room like a ticking clock. He could feel America behind him, watching, waiting, evaluating him, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, as a man holding 12 lives in his hands, and that realization terrified him more than any rifle ever could. When the pressure gauge began creeping downward, slowly, steadily, Nolan exhaled the breath he'd been holding. The guards leaned in. Friedrich tightened one last bolt, but he wasn't thinking about the generator anymore. He was thinking about how easily lies shattered when people simply looked at each other. He was thinking about how much propaganda he had swallowed without questioning. He was thinking about what might happen next. If the Americans continued treating him not like a monster, but like a technician whose expertise mattered. And for the first time since the Normandy invasion, Friedrich felt something dangerously close to hope. A feeling he didn't trust, a feeling he wasn't ready for, a feeling that terrified him more than darkness. It should have ended there, Friedrich stabilizing the pressure, the Americans hauling him back to his bunk, the camp returning to its rigid wartime routines. That was the version of the story he expected, the one propaganda had trained into his bones. But what happened next was the opposite of everything he'd been taught, a twist so jarring he almost stepped back from it, because instead of dragging him away in cuffs, the Americans stayed with him, and they brought food. The generator still needed work, lots of it. The safety coil had burnt through, 2 connection plates were warped, and one of the pressure valves rattled with every vibration, threatening to crack. Friedrich rolled up his sleeves and got to work, fully aware that every second without power meant the infirmary remained suspended in a dangerous, half-functioning state. Sweat dripped down his temples. The air in the generator room was thick, hotter than the Mississippi night outside, almost suffocating. He thought the guards would be irritated, impatient, watching him like a hawk. Instead, they hovered like anxious apprentices. Private Nolan was the first to break the pattern. "You need more light?" he asked, stepping closer. Before Friedrich could answer, another soldier hoisted a lantern and held it up high. A third found a second lantern and propped it on a toolbox. A fourth walked in carrying an old hand-crank fan, waving it back and forth to move the air. The sudden collaboration stunned Friedrich so much he almost dropped his wrench. This wasn't how captors acted. This wasn't how enemies acted. This wasn't even how many German officers had acted toward their own men. It was cooperation, genuine cooperation. 30 minutes into the repairs, the door swung open again. Friedrich looked up, expecting another guard. Instead, a corporal he'd never seen before entered with a small metal tray. He pushed past the soldiers huddled near the generator and set it down on the only clean surface in the room, a low wooden shelf beside the control panel. On the tray sat a steaming metal cup of hot coffee, a thick sandwich layered with ham, cheese, and a smear of mustard, and a folded napkin. Friedrich stared at it like it was a hallucination. The corporal jerked his thumb toward the food. "Eat." Friedrich shook his head instinctively. "No, I can't." He wasn't refusing because he wasn't hungry. He hadn't eaten in nearly 7 hours. He wasn't refusing because he disliked the food. He hadn't tasted mustard in over a year. He refused because deep in his gut, he feared it was a trick, a test, a trap, something he'd be punished for. In Germany, prisoners who took favors were often beaten for the audacity. In the Atlantic transport camps, anything extra was seen as bribery. He raised his hands slightly, palms out. "I do not need." Private Nolan cut him off. "Engineers don't run on air," he said, nudging the tray forward. "Eat." The tone wasn't cruel or sarcastic. It wasn't even commanding. It was practical, as if offering a prisoner hot coffee was the most natural thing in the world. That alone nearly shattered Friedrich's composure. He looked around the room, hoping to find some sign this was a joke, but every American face showed the same thing. Tired sincerity, urgency, a shared goal. The storm battered the roof, rain hammering like fists. Pipes hissed and metal clanged. The lanterns flickered. And amid all that chaos, a German POW sat in the center of an American generator room, staring at a sandwich he was too afraid to touch. Nolan stepped closer. "You're sweating through your shirt," he said. "You'll pass out if you don't eat." Friedrich hesitated, then slowly, carefully took the sandwich. His hands trembled. He took a bite. Warm bread, real ham, creamy mustard, salt, fat, something dangerously close to pleasure or relief, moved through him. He blinked rapidly, overwhelmed. No trap, no punishment, just a meal. A meal offered in the middle of a storm, to a man whose only value at that moment was the knowledge in his hands. A kindness so simple and human it felt almost impossible. As Friedrich ate, he noticed something else, something that twisted the knife of realization even deeper. None of the Americans looked surprised by the food. None looked guilty or conflicted or ashamed. This was normal for them. Hot coffee, fresh bread, meat, mustard, even on a stormy night in a POW camp. He knew the numbers from leaflets and intelligence briefs, but now, sitting here, he felt them. America's Midwestern wheat belt feeding the world. Texas cattle and Kansas corn supplying the Army. Factories producing so much that even prisoners received 3,200 to 4,000 calories a day. Meanwhile, his own people, his own family, stood in ration lines that stretched around blocks. Children in Hamburg were eating turnip soup watered down to translucence. Soldiers on the Eastern Front boiled leather for broth. The contrast was sickening, enraging, humbling, and, tonight, painfully personal. Private Nolan must have read something in Friedrich's expression because he pulled over a crate and sat down beside him. "My mom sent that mustard," he said casually, thumb-tapping the sandwich crust. "She mails me jars every month, says Army food tastes like cardboard." Friedrich almost laughed. It came out as a soft, stunned breath through his nose. "You share it with—" He gestured weakly. "Me?" "Why wouldn't I?" Nolan said. The answer seemed so obvious to him that Friedrich couldn't speak for several moments. In Germany, soldiers didn't share rations with prisoners. In Germany, officers barely shared rations with their men. In Germany, kindness was rationed more tightly than food. But here, an American private handed over a piece of his home, his mother's mustard, without a second thought. Fueled by warmth he hadn't expected, Friedrich got back to work. Nolan stood beside him holding a lantern. Another soldier tightened a bolt he could reach better. Someone else rotated the fan, giving Friedrich relief from the stifling heat. They worked like a small, strange team. One soldier fetched a tool with barely a word. Another ran to the shed for replacement parts. A third asked if Friedrich needed clean cloths. It would have looked absurd from the outside, a POW surrounded by Americans helping him fix their own equipment. But from inside the moment, it felt right. Everyone's goal was the same: keep the generator alive. The machine hissed loudly as Friedrich replaced a cracked seal. The room vibrated harder with each adjustment. Nolan leaned closer. "Is it going to hold?" "It will," Friedrich said, tightening the last bolt. "But we must restart it slowly." "For the infirmary?" Nolan asked. Friedrich nodded, and the way Nolan exhaled, half relief, half prayer, told him everything he needed to know about these men. They weren't performing for their superiors. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were simply terrified of losing the wounded soldiers depending on that machine. Compassion, not cruelty, drove them. Duty, not dominance. Humanity, not hatred. This realization hit Friedrich so hard he nearly faltered. As the generator's motor coughed back to life, a deep rumble that slowly steadied into a strong rotation, the Americans all stepped back in unison. Their shoulders dropped with exhaustion and relief. The lantern light reflected off their faces, revealing something Friedrich didn't expect. Pride. Not arrogance, not superiority, not triumph over an enemy, just pride in having done something good. Together, with a man they'd been told was a sworn enemy. Nolan clapped Friedrich gently on the shoulder. "You did good tonight." Friedrich didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded. too overwhelmed to trust his voice. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, the generator hummed. For the first time in months, Friedrich felt warm, and somewhere deep inside him, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fear, beneath the years of propaganda, something fragile and dangerous flickered to life. Admiration for a country he had been taught to despise, admiration for soldiers who treated him like a partner instead of a prisoner, admiration for a nation wealthy enough to feed even its enemies, and principled enough to do it. He didn't know it yet, but this night would haunt him for decades, because this was the moment he first understood the impossible, humbling truth. These Americans were not the villains of his story. Maybe they never had been. It happened so fast that none of them, even the Americans, had time to react. Just as Friedrich tightened the final bolt on the pressure valve, the generator screamed. A sharp metallic shriek cut through the room, followed by a violent jolt that sent sparks snapping into the air. Then, boom! A small but deafening blast kicked from the side panel. The lanterns shook. The whole room lurched. For a split second, Friedrich saw white. His ears rang. His knees buckled. His chest clenched around a single, absolute certainty. This is it. They'll think I sabotaged it. They'll shoot me where I stand. His brain didn't even process pain, only terror. Muscle memory, drilled into him by years under Nazi officers, told him exactly what to do. He dropped to the floor instinctively, hands over his head, waiting for boots, for fists, for the rifle barrel against his skull. He braced for death. But that's not what happened. What happened was impossible. Boots thundered toward him, but instead of dragging him up or beating him down, the Americans formed a shield around him. Bodies lunged between him and the generator, arms thrown out, instinctively protecting him from the debris flying off the casing. Private Nolan grabbed Friedrich's shoulder and shoved him backward, not violently but to get him away from danger. "Get down! Stay behind us!" he yelled. The words didn't make sense. Stay behind us. Us protecting him? Friedrich blinked, stunned as the guards crouched low in front of him, rifles pointed at the malfunctioning machine. Not at him. It took him several seconds to realize that no one had even looked at him with suspicion. No one shouted, "Sabotage!" No one accused him of treachery. Their faces all showed the same thing: fear for his safety. His safety. That single detail cracked something deep inside him. As the machine sputtered, coughing metallic dust, Friedrich felt something unfamiliar and terrifying building in his chest. His breath hitched. His throat tightened. His fingers shook uncontrollably. When Nolan turned to him, eyes wide, breath heavy, and asked, "You okay?" Friedrich couldn't answer. He covered his face with both hands, partly out of shock and partly to hide the emotion overwhelming him. But it was too late. His body betrayed him. A sound, half gasp, half sob, escaped his throat. The first tear hit the floor. He hadn't cried when his unit was bombed in Cannes. He hadn't cried crossing the Atlantic in chains. He hadn't cried when letters from home stopped coming. But now, in a hot generator room in a Mississippi POW camp, surrounded by American soldiers shielding him from harm, he broke. Tears came fast, messy, uncontrollable, humiliating. His shoulders shook, and he pressed his palms into his eyes, as if he could push the shame back in. He was crying in front of enemies. Crying in front of men he'd been told were animals, savages, monsters, and they weren't laughing. They weren't sneering. They weren't calling him weak. Nolan crouched beside him. "You're all right," he said softly. "You're all right, Keller." The gentleness in his voice shattered the last piece of the world Friedrich thought he When Friedrich finally managed to speak, his voice cracked like a broken wire. "I was told—" He swallowed hard. "I was told Americans had no honor." It spilled out before he could stop it. A raw confession. A lifetime of propaganda condensed into a single sentence. The room went quiet. Nolan exhaled, slow and steady, as if choosing his words wasn't just important. It was sacred. "My father taught me," he said, "you treat a man like a man, even when he's on the wrong side of the war." He said it simply, without performance, without expecting gratitude. A truth passed down from one generation of Americans to the next. And Friedrich felt the truth settle into him like warm coal in a cold furnace. Nolan stood and offered Friedrich a hand. Friedrich stared at it, stunned, hesitant, then took it. Nolan pulled him up gently, steadying him with a hand on his arm. Another soldier grabbed a jacket and draped it over Friedrich's shoulders. Someone handed him a rag to wipe his face. No one commented on his tears. In Germany, tears marked weakness. In Germany, breakdowns were punished. In Germany, engineers were tools, not people. But these Americans, these farm boys, steelworkers' sons, kids raised in Midwest towns and Dust Bowl counties, they lived by a different code. Fair play, dignity, respect, earned or not. It was what the greatest generation taught their children at kitchen tables, on front porches, in church pews, in the cornfields and wheat belts and small-town ballparks. Do the right thing. Don't kick a man when he's down. A handshake means something. Honor matters. Friedrich had never understood those ideas until this exact moment. The explosion had been a pressure burp, a dangerous one, but not fatal. Together, Friedrich and the Americans stabilized the remaining valves. When the generator finally roared into a healthy hum, the room filled with a wave of exhausted relief. But the noise barely registered. Friedrich was still staring at Nolan's hand, the one that had pulled him up, the one that had gripped his shoulder protectively. Why? Why would they risk themselves for him? He finally forced out the question. Why? Why did you protect me? I am a prisoner. Nolan looked at him as if the answer were obvious. Because you're a man, and you were in danger. Simple words, but they landed on Friedrich like revelation. The moment the machine stabilized, Friedrich turned away, gripping the edge of the control panel so tightly his knuckles bleached white. Everything inside him was buckling. His beliefs, his certainty, the story he'd been fed since childhood. He whispered, barely audible, "I don't understand any of this." Nolan stepped beside him. "You don't have to," he said. "Just know you're safe here." The word safe cut right through Friedrich. He'd never associated safety with captivity. He'd never associated compassion with enemies. He'd never associated honor with America. But tonight, all three collided, hard. Friedrich wiped his face with the rag, trembling. Nolan pretended not to notice. Around them, the soldiers packed up tools, secured valves, and murmured quietly about the storm, about the infirmary, about how Keller worked like hell tonight. No suspicion, no resentment, just respect. And that, more than anything, terrified Friedrich. Because now he wasn't afraid of the Americans. He was afraid of what it meant that they'd been kind to him. Afraid of what it said about Germany, about the war, about everything he had been taught. Afraid that the world he knew was collapsing, and that the one replacing it required the courage to admit he had been wrong. He wasn't ready for that. But the first fracture had already formed, and there was no going back. It was the strangest twist of all. The night Friedrich Keller broke down in the generator room became the night he stopped being a prisoner in his own mind. Something shifted. Quietly, deeply, irrevocably. Because the next morning, before the Americans even asked, Friedrich was already back on his feet, helping. And this time he wasn't doing it out of fear. He was doing it because he wanted to. The sun rose, pale and sluggish, through the Mississippi mist. Camp Shelby, still soaked from the storm, smelled of wet earth and diesel fuel. Most POWs trudged into formation half awake, boots caked with mud. But Friedrich stood apart, not visibly, just internally. He felt lighter, not safe, not free, but unburdened. For the first time since Normandy, his mind wasn't consumed by distrust. He kept replaying the Iiwina night before. Nolan shielding him, the men forming a circle around him, the sandwich, the warmth, the honesty, the relief. Every piece had cracked the wall inside him a little more. He wasn't sure what this feeling was, but it was pulling him toward the Americans instead of away from them. At mid-morning, a guard jogged across the yard, calling for assistance at the pump house. The overnight storm had flooded half the lower trench and the old water pump couldn't keep up. Before the guard even named volunteers, Friedrich stepped forward. "I can help," he said. The guard stared, surprised. "You sure, Keller? You don't have to." But Friedrich nodded. "I want to." 15 minutes later, he stood ankle-deep in icy water, shirt sleeves rolled up, tightening a valve while two Americans held planks above the mud to brace the pipe. When the pump sputtered to life, spraying water across their boots, one of the Americans, Private Tully, laughed and slapped Friedrich hard on the back. "Hell," Tully said, shouting over the machine. "He works harder than half our boys." The comment should have embarrassed Friedrich. Instead, it made him stand a little straighter. Over the next week, something remarkable happened. Friedrich became useful. Not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a man with skills the Americans respected. He repaired 3 faulty water pumps, a broken heating pipe in barracksy, a jammed boiler valve behind the kitchen, and half the lighting grid in Compound C. He even fixed the squeaking hinges on the guardhouse door, quietly, without telling anyone, just because he could. Each time, the Americans looked at him with the same bemused gratitude, as if they couldn't fully reconcile the idea of a German prisoner stepping forward willingly. But that wasn't the real miracle. The real miracle was that Friedrich started teaching them. Private Nolan was the first to ask. They were inspecting the boiler room when Nolan cleared his throat and said, almost shyly, "Keller, you think you could show me how to read those pressure numbers? Might help next time." Friedrich blinked. A German POW teaching an American soldier. It felt like breaking a law of nature. But Nolan waited patiently, shoulders relaxed, hands tucked in his pockets, not as a superior demanding instruction, but as a man eager to learn. So Friedrich showed him. By the next afternoon, 2 more soldiers joined. And then 3. Soon he had an unofficial little workshop at the edge of the motor pool, using scrap parts to demonstrate wiring and mechanics. Nolan grinned through every lesson. "Your Kraut's turning us into engine men," Tully joked. "He's not our Kraut," Nolan shot back. "He's Keller." The distinction slammed into Friedrich's chest with almost physical force. They weren't calling him a prisoner. They were calling him by his name. As he worked, Friedrich couldn't avoid noticing something else. The things the Americans gave the POWs. Things he'd never expected. Warm wool blankets, replaced every winter. Enormous trays of food. Meat, beans, bread, potatoes. More than he'd eaten in years. A camp library with donated American novels, dictionaries, even engineering manuals. Sports fields where Americans and Germans sometimes played baseball together. Opportunities to write letters home, letters that actually got delivered. Payment for labor, up to 80 cents a day in canteen credit. No beatings, no starvation, no humiliation. Everything he had been told about American brutality evaporated in the face of this daily abundance, and Friedrich realized he owed these men something, not because he had to, but because they had chosen, freely, to treat him with dignity. A debt of the heart, not of obedience. One cold afternoon, Friedrich found himself sitting beside Nolan on a wooden crate behind the generator building. They shared a tin cup of weak coffee and watched POWs play soccer in the yard. Neither spoke at first. Finally, Nolan said, "You know, I forget sometimes we're supposed to be enemies." Friedrich let out a quiet laugh. "Yes, I think. I forget, too." Nolan nudged him with his elbow. "My dad used to say," he began, "if you want to know a man's character, watch how he works with his hands." Friedrich looked down at his own, grease-stained, calloused, burned with tiny blisters. "And what do my hands say?" he asked. "That you're decent," Nolan replied. "That you're trying," then softer, "and that you don't belong on the other side of any line I can see." Friedrich swallowed hard. No German had ever said something like that to him, no officer, no comrade, no teacher, but an American private, half his age, said it without hesitation. Work continued. Days blurred into weeks. New tasks emerged. Friedrich moved around the camp not like a prisoner but like a technician on call, and every time he passed, the stocked mess hall, the warm barracks, the shelves of library books, the baseball field where prisoners laughed the guard post where no one raised a rifle at him, he felt a mix of awe and shame twist inside him. This country, this America, had no logical reason to treat him this well. Yet it did, because that was the American way. Because fairness wasn't a tactic. It was a principle. Because the greatest generation had been raised on honor, not hatred. Because mercy, here, was a form of strength. Late one evening, Friedrich lay in his bunk, listening to the soft hum of the repaired generator outside. He stared at the ceiling, hands folded over his chest, heart full in a way he didn't recognize. A thought crept into his mind, soft, tentative, frightening. Maybe the Americans are the good ones. He turned onto his side, troubled. It felt like betrayal. It felt like truth. As he drifted into sleep, one phrase whispered through him, the same phrase thousands of viewers would think upon hearing his story. This is why America was great. It should have been a simple weather update, but the moment the warning spread across Camp Shelby, it landed with the force of another explosion. A second storm, far worse than the first, was barreling toward Mississippi. Wind fast enough to snap telephone poles, rain heavy enough to drown the trenches, lightning sharp enough to wipe out the entire grid. And with the generator still fragile, everyone knew the truth. One direct hit could shut down the whole camp again. Friedrich heard the announcement as he tightened the last bolt on a repaired boiler line. He froze, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He'd seen storms like this on the Baltic coast, storms that tore metal from rooftops and ripped wires from concrete. If Camp Shelby went dark again, the Americans might not be lucky a second time. The infirmary wouldn't be lucky a second time, and neither would the generator he had nearly died trying to save. A strange, bold idea sparked in his mind. Mad, improvised, risky, and exactly the kind of thing he would never have dared before. That afternoon, Friedrich approached Nolan and the other mechanics with an urgency that startled them. "I can build a backup system," he said. Not asked. Not ordered. Volunteered. Nolan raised an eyebrow. "A backup? With what? We don't have spare parts for half the things we already use." Friedrich shook his head. not traditional parts, but we have what we need." He pointed across the yard, to the scrap pile behind the motor pool. Old oil drums, bent copper wire, 2 broken alternators, rusting truck generator coils, a stack of discarded spark plugs. To the Americans, it was trash. To Friedrich, it was possibility. Nolan exhaled, a slow, incredulous whistle. "You're telling me you can build a safety rig out of junk?" "Yes," Friedrich said simply. "If we don't try, the storm will break everything again." There was a pause. Then Nolan clapped him on the back. "Then let's get to work." They cleared a space behind the maintenance shed. The sky turned a sickly green-gray, the color Southern farmers recognized as tornado weather. Wind slapped the trees sideways, but Friedrich barely noticed. He was fully in his element. He drew diagrams on the dirt with a stick. He explained each coil, each wire, each conversion step. He climbed into oil drums to check their curvature. He hammered dents out of alternator housings with the confidence of a man who had fixed machines and bombed out factories. Nolan and the other Americans watched as he rebuilt the world from scraps. "Damn," one mechanic muttered. "Your Kraut's a magician." "He's not a Kraut," Nolan corrected. "He's Keller." Friedrich heard it, pretended he didn't, felt the words lodge somewhere deep. They worked for hours. Sweat poured. Thunder rolled. The smell of hot metal filled the air. Friedrich guided every step. "This drum becomes the housing. Wrap the copper tighter. No, the coil must align with the armature. Yes, good, that is right." By dusk they had assembled something crude but functional, a hand-built wartime Frankenstein of a backup generator. Ugly, uneven, patched together with faith and desperation. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't standard, but it could save lives. As they worked, the Americans weren't just helpers. They were hosts. Private Tully brought sweet tea from the mess hall. Corporal Hayes passed around cornbread wrapped in cloth. Someone started humming an old Southern hymn, low under his breath. It reminded Friedrich of something he had heard whispered in camp already. The South took hospitality seriously, even in wartime. Mississippi boys offered what little they had. Alabama farm kids shared their canteen chocolate. Louisiana mechanics joked and taught him slang. There was a warmth here, rough-edged, loud, imperfect, but undeniably real. And in the middle of it, Friedrich Keller, once an engineer for the Reich, felt something he had never expected to feel on American soil: belonging. Just before the first sheets of rain hit, Friedrich tightened the final bolt. The backup unit hummed, low but steady. Nolan's face lit with relief. "You did it," he said. He wasn't exaggerating. They all knew it. If the storm destroyed the main generator, this patchwork contraption might be the only thing keeping the infirmary alive. Friedrich wiped grease from his hands, exhausted but proud. And then something stirred inside him. A weight, a memory, a truth he'd carried too long. He reached into his coat pocket. In his hand lay a small, round object, worn from years of use, the metal dulled around the edges, the chain slightly bent. A German pocket watch. His father's. The one his father had carried through the Russian front. The one recovered from his body after Stalingrad. The only heirloom Friedrich had left. He had never shown it to anyone in America, never removed it from his pocket during inspections, never let himself imagine parting with it. But tonight felt different. He stepped toward Nolan. "Nolan," he said quietly, I want you to have this." Nolan frowned. "What is it?" Friedrich opened his palm. The American's eyes widened. "Keller, I can't take your father's." "You can," Friedrich whispered. "You must." Nolan shook his head. "Why? Why give this to me?" Friedrich swallowed hard. His voice trembled. "Because you gave me back my humanity." The words hovered between them, heavy, fragile, true. Nolan's mouth tightened. He blinked against the wind, but Friedrich knew it wasn't just the wind. The other Americans fell silent too. This wasn't just a gift. It was absolution. It was gratitude. It was a bridge. A German son offering his father's last memory to an American soldier in the middle of a war meant to make them enemies. Nolan closed Friedrich's fingers over the watch for a moment, as if making sure the gesture sank all the way in. Then he placed a hand on Friedrich's shoulder. "You didn't owe us anything," Nolan said softly. "But I'm damn proud you're with us now." Proud. Friedrich didn't realize how desperately he needed that word until it hit him. The sky darkened. The storm began its assault. Men rushed to strap down equipment. Lanterns flickered. But for a moment, just a heartbeat, in the middle of the Mississippi mud, a German prisoner and an American soldier stood facing each other, bound by something neither of them had expected to find in war: trust, respect, and the beginnings of an unlikely brotherhood. Somewhere in Camp Shelby, a guard watching from the mess hall muttered under his breath, "Well, I'll be damned. That German's more one of us than half the boys from Baton Rouge." Men with fathers who built planes in 1944, men with grandfathers who served in the Pacific, men who grew up hearing stories of America's mercy. Tonight they would feel those stories come alive, and they would wipe their eyes, not from the rain, but from something deeper, because this was the America they wanted to believe in again. In war, some nights vanish into history, and the night a German POW built a backup generator for an American camp became the kind of story families whisper about long after uniforms are folded away. A night that should have divided enemies ended up binding two men and two nations together. But no one understood that better than Friedrich Keller himself. When the war ended, the gates of Camp Shelby opened, and the German prisoners walked out, not toward punishment, but toward repatriation. Trucks rumbled, orders were shouted, and the Mississippi dust rose around them like a farewell curtain. Friedrich paused before boarding the transport truck. He looked back at the generator building, the motor pool, the dirt lot where he'd given Nolan the pocket watch. Those places had reshaped him. He wasn't the same man who had arrived months earlier in iron-cold shackles. Back in Germany, he found a country bruised beyond recognition. Charred buildings, bread lines curling around corners, children playing where bombs had fallen, factories the Allies hadn't yet rebuilt. His family home was gone. His mother had died during a harsh winter. His brother was missing on the Eastern Front. He stepped off the transport with a satchel and only two possessions worth keeping: the photograph of Camp Shelby, taken by an American medic, the letter Nolan had slipped into his hand the day they parted. He showed both to his relatives. "I survived," he told them, "because America showed mercy." And later, when the evenings grew quiet and the radio hummed with static, he repeated it softly. "America was powerful because it was kind." These words became lore in the Keller household, told over kitchen tables, in living rooms, and at family reunions where grandchildren listened with round, quiet eyes. As years passed, Friedrich married, raised children, and rebuilt his life brick by brick. He opened an electrical workshop, teaching apprentices with the same patience he once used on American soldiers. And he told the same 3 stories over and over: how American guards gave POWs more food than they had seen in years, how a Mississippi private shielded him from an explosion, how kindness, not armor, had saved him. He always ended with the same line: "My life did not belong to the Reich. It belonged to the men in Camp Shelby who treated me as a man." His children memorized the words. His grandchildren repeated them. His great-grandchildren cherished them. 50 years later, when the world had changed beyond recognition, when Germany was prosperous and peaceful, and America had become a land of universities and technology, one of Friedrich's great-grandsons, Lucas Keller, received a scholarship to study in the United States. His destination? Mississippi. The coincidence felt like fate. Lucas carried something with him across the Atlantic, tucked carefully into a padded envelope, wrapped in cloth, protected like a relic. Not the photograph, not the letter, but something older, something heavier with meaning. The pocket watch Friedrich once gave away, returned years later to the Keller family by the Nolan family after Nolan's death, a gesture of friendship that had outlived both men. Lucas arrived at the Camp Shelby Military Museum on a quiet autumn morning. The air was crisp. The leaves were turning. The old barracks, refurbished now, stood like silent witnesses to history. He found the exhibit on POWs in America. There were photos of baseball games, barracks life, workshops where prisoners built furniture. Visitors murmured around him. Americans, veterans, school groups. Lucas approached the glass display case dedicated to POW engineers. His hands trembled. He reached into his bag, removed the pocket watch, and placed it gently on the glass. A curator stepped forward, startled. "Sir, can I help you?" Lucas nodded once, eyes glistening. "My grandfather told me—" He swallowed. "He told me your country saved his soul." The room fell silent. A veteran in his 70s removed his cap. A teacher placed a hand over her heart. A young boy leaned closer, staring at the watch as if it were a holy thing. Because it was. To an outsider, it was just metal and gears, but to anyone who knew the story, it held an entire universe of meaning. A German son honoring an American soldier, a prisoner thanking his captor, a kindness defying war, a lesson passed down across oceans and generations. The curator's voice trembled as she asked, "Would you like this to stay here?" "Yes," Lucas whispered. "It belongs to both our families now." And with that, the watch became part of the museum's permanent exhibit. Every visitor who passed that display read the small plaque beneath it, written from the family's shared recollection. This watch belonged to Friedrich Keller, a German POW at Camp Shelby. He survived the war because American soldiers treated him with dignity. He taught them machinery. They taught him humanity. He gave this watch to Private Nolan in gratitude. 2 families kept the friendship alive for 3 generations. People stood before it and wept, softly, openly, gratefully, because it reminded them of something they feared America might be losing: decency, honor, unity, the quiet strength of the greatest generation, the courage to show mercy even when the world demanded revenge. And every tear was the same story whispered in a different voice. This was the America I grew up hearing about. My grandfather would have been proud. We used to be this kind of country. Letters came to the Keller family from across the United States. Children, veterans, historians, even strangers who'd seen the exhibit and felt moved by it. All of them echoing the same sentiment. Thank you. Thank you for remembering who we were, and who we still can be. Because Friedrich's story wasn't about a watch, or a generator, or a storm. It was about the truth his children and grandchildren carried like sacred scripture. America was powerful because it was kind. America was victorious because it was decent. America saved his life not by force, but by mercy. And that message, across decades, borders, and generations, became the final chapter of a story that began on a dark Mississippi night. A story that still whispers to every American who hears it. This is who we were. This is who we can be again.